So what I'd like to do today is talk about residue gifts and how to deal with them and those kinds of things. So feel free to, we'll probably hold questions for the end, and I'll run through sort of some of my tips for this and how to use it. So the first thing is that the way estate planner conceives of residue gifts is the idea of segments or percentages. And the idea is that you've got to give away all of the estate. And so clients often think of giving away their estate in percentages. And so that's why we use that. So the idea is that you can create a segment, which is a percentage. And a segment is either 100%, in which case it's the only segment, or it's a smaller percentage, and then you're going to need other segments to fill in the 100%. So let me give an example, and then we'll go back to when you use segments and then how to subdivide, because once you've created a specific amount or a segment for a percentage, you can further divide that into smaller amounts. But let me take a couple of simple scenarios and then we'll go through some more complicated. So the test I always use, and I'm just going to call this up on my screen. When am I going to use a single segment for 100%? Well, I'm going to use a single segment in two situations. One, where there's 100% of the residue going to one person. That's an easy one. The other time that you're going to use 100% segment and then divide it into smaller segments is if you're dividing it among multiple people, so 100% divided among multiple people, and on two conditions. One, it's going to be equally, and two, it's on the exact same terms. So they're all getting it absolutely with a gift over to their issue and then to other people's issue, the client's issue, for example. As long as everybody's dealing with it in the same way, then you can deal with it that way. If it's not one of those two, then you're going to want to use multiple segments. So let's start with the simple one. So here we are in the surviving spouse scenario, and we're going to show a very simple gift. 100% of the spouse. So segment one. Now the name on the segment, if there's going to be more than one segment, so if it's a single segment, you don't have to worry about this, but if it's going to be more than one segment, the segment is going to be identified in the drafting by the name. So if we call it segment one, it'll say, okay, take segment one, which represents X% of the residue, and deal with it this way. You could change that so that it reads some other name, and I'll show you how to do that and what the effect of that will be in a second. But if it's 100%, you don't have to change the name ever, because it's going to recognize that that's the entire residue. And so it'll just say the residue of my estate. So segment one for 100% add. And then once you've created the segment, which is the percentage, now you have to do something with it. And that's the adding the gift stage. So the first stage is creating the percentage. That's the segment. And the next stage is dealing with that segment or that percentage. So we want to add a gift. So we'll click on add gift. And let's just take the simple scenario where we're going to leave it all to the spouse, which is Phil. And it's an absolute gift. The amount. So in this case, it's 100% of the segment. This is the percentage of the segment. So we've said segment one, what percentage of the segment? We want to give away 100% of 100%. And then gift over, if you wanted to provide for that, you could do that, and conditions, etc. And then you go add. And you can see the outer ring is the segment size, and the inner ring is the disposition of that segment. So we're giving away 100% segment one and 100% of 100%. So that's how we do it. And then to move back to the segment page, you just click on the gray segment and you can see. Now, if we tried to add another segment, we can't, because it has to add up to 100%. We've already given away 100%. So that's the simple one. Let's go to the more complicated one. So let's go to the scenario where, and let's using our little test of we're going to use 100% segment if we're dividing it among multiple people equally on the same exact terms. Well, the most common situation there is a gift to children equally. So in that case, I typically would use one segment, and I'd say add a segment for 100%, and I wouldn't change the name, and I'd go add. And now I've got to deal with that segment. Now I've created 100%. Now what do I do with it? Well, this is what I do with it. I'm going to create a gift. Let's say it doesn't matter which you pick, absolute or trust, but it's all going to be the same, and it's going to be divided equally among all those people. So the classic one is to the children. So we say, okay, I want you to divide 100% equally among the children, okay, in separate trusts. And then as long as the terms are the same, whatever the terms are, they're all going to get it at age 30. You know, they're all going to get a lump sum at 25, you know, of a certain amount from their share, because these, of course, are separate trusts. Each trust is separate. So as long as everybody's being treated the same, and then if they're not alive, it's going to go to that beneficiary's issue, and then to the client's issue if they don't have children, the beneficiary doesn't have issue, as the alternate gift over. And that's how you would create, you'd use one segment but divide it among multiple people. And let me just show you how that's going to generate in the will. So we go to documents, we're going to go single will. We don't need any of these things in there. We're just going to generate it. And what it's going to say is take the residue of my estate, because it recognizes that 100% segment represents the entire residue. So it's going to use that term. And then it's going to either give it directly to the spouse, or it's going to give it in the second scenario to the kids equally. So let me just show you where that is. And it's right here. So it says residue of my estate. I direct my trustees to deal with the residue of my estate as follows. And it says to pay the residue. The reason it says the residue here is because it's 100%. So it says pay the residue to Phil. And then the next scenario is if my spouse is not alive, then it says, I want you to deal with the residue, because it recognizes 100%, divide the residue into as many equal shares as is necessary. And then it's going to draft that. So that's how you do the simple one. Okay. Let me do the more complicated one. So in this situation, let's just clear this out. So we go segments. I'm just going to remove this segment completely. And what maybe we'll do here is just stop and let anybody who has any questions at this stage to fire away. So feel free to unmute and ask any questions if anybody has. All right. Well, then let's move on to a more complicated situation. So the downside, let me just tell you one downside to using the single segment, that 100% segment for multiple people. In the summary, so when you look at the summary, the graphic summary, what it's going to say is it's not going to identify each individual person here because you're doing a class gift. So it's just good. Oh, sorry, I don't think I generated the right one. Oh, I didn't put any. This is the other distribution, but it'll just say children, and it won't say, you know, dividing it equally or anything like that. It'll just identify the group of beneficiaries who are getting the 100%. I'll show you that in a moment. It's just I haven't filled it in. So let me show you. So I'll just show you basically what I've just said about the summary, just to show you that. So the downside is we've made it 100% divided equally among the children. On the summary page, it's just going to say my children in one segment. That's the downside of it, I guess. Although I've never had a client who didn't understand what it meant that the children were getting it equally like this, rather than identifying them, showing each person getting a different percentage. But that's the only thing to know about that. So let's then go to this, and I'll just remove that completely. Let's go to a more complicated situation. So we're going to use multiple segments in this scenario. Why? Because we want to divide it among multiple people, but it's not equally, or it's not on the exact same terms, okay? So this is how you would do that. You would go add segment, and let's just take a, I don't know, we'll divide among 3 people. Let's say a third, a third, a third. So you're going to put in the percentage, which is a third. And now you've created a segment for a third, and you're going to add now a gift. What are you going to do with that? Well, we're going to pick Alex Dunphy to get that 1/3. And we're going to have a gift over to his issue. And that's really as far as you have to go, because we use, of course, the floating shares. So it's going to say if either Alex Dunphy or any of his issue are alive, create 33 1/3 shares and deal with it. If Alex is not alive and he has no issue, then those shares don't get created. And of course, everybody moves up pro rata. So that's built in. So you don't need to go further than that. So then we go add, and that's a gift. And now we can see that we've given away a third, 100% of 1/3. Okay. So then we go back to the segments and we click add a segment. And this is going to be segment 2. And this is going to be also a third. So I'm going to actually be building it so that you can do it by parts as opposed to percentage. You'll have the option, but for right now. So then this is going to go to Luke, but in a slightly different way, because we've got a third, but of that third, we want a specific gift to go to someone, a specific amount, in other words, but it's out of this 1/3. How are we going to do that? Well, we want, I'm not sure what that is. Oh, that's, got it.
Yep.
Oh, all right. So how do we do that? We want to make a gift to Luke of $10,000 from this 1/3. Well, this is how you do it. So we created 1/3, and now we're going to pick Luke as the beneficiary. The amount is going to be a fixed amount, and it's going to be $10,000. Okay, and you can make a gift over whatever you want to do. So that's that. But we haven't given away. There's still, you can see, there's still 100% remaining of that third in percentages. So we need to add another gift. We need to give that, the rest of that third, to Mitchell, and he's going to get 100% of that third. Okay, and we can go add. And now we've given away 100% of that 1/3. We've given 10,000 off the top and then 100% of the balance. And then the last segment we're going to create, and we're going to change that to 33 1/3 so everyone gets the same amount. And it recognizes, by the way, that that's 100%. It knows that that's 100%. So now we're going to divide that gift of a third into different shares. So we want half of that 1/3 to go to Jay. So we're going to say, okay, how much of that segment are we giving to Jay? Well, we're giving 50% of that 1/3 to Jay. Now we got to give away the other 50%. So the other 50% of that third is going to Lily. Okay, and we'll say to her issue if she's not live. So that's how we create a more complicated gift. Now let's look at what the will looks like when we generate that. So we go Documents, Single Will, and then I'll open up the floor for questions. And again, it's drafted so that if somebody's not alive, that third, that percentage doesn't lapse, because in the will, it doesn't refer to percentages. You'll note it refers to parts and portions, and because we don't want a lapse. And so this prevents a lapse. So here we have the will, and we'll just go to the balance of the estate, the residue section here. And so, we left the gift to Phil as the first scenario, but here's the second scenario. So if my spouse is not alive and if I leave issue, because there are two different gifts, there's different gifts if the issue are alive, and then a third type of gift, a third set of instructions if everyone's gone. So that's why it defines it that way. So now we want you to divide the residue this way. So as many equal parts. So here's a third, and we call that segment 1. If we had changed the name, if you wanted this share to be called Alex's share, well, then just change the name of the segment from segment 1 to Alex's share in the portal. And then it'll print out 33 parts, 33.3 parts, Alex's share, to pay Alex's share to Alex if he is alive. So here's the gift. And it always begins with this kind of wording, because we only want to deal with these 33 parts if one of these people, at least one of these people, is alive. And of course, floating shares always talks about divided into as many equal parts as is necessary. So if it's not necessary to create this, then you don't create those 33 shares. And then there's only 66.6 shares, and each of the other sets of beneficiaries are getting 33.3 of 66.6, which equals 50%. That's how floating shares work. So the next one was that gift where we had take 33 parts, 33.3, that's segment 2, and now pay $10,000 to Luke and the balance of segment 2 to Mitchell. So that's how we dealt with that. And then here was the more complicated one where we had take 33.3 parts, and now we've got to divide that further. So then divide those into further portions as are necessary, and take portion 1, which is 50 portions of 33.3 parts, give 50 portions to J, give 50 portions and divide those, you give those to Lily, and if she's not alive, to her issue. And that's how the distribution works. And in the third scenario, we had a different distribution in the third scenario. So the third scenario says, if I have no spouse and no issue, now this is what I want you to do with it. So I'm just going to unmute everybody and see if that made sense. Any questions about that from anybody? Does that concept make sense? Is there anybody have any suggestions? As I said, I'm going to create it so that you can actually choose between, do you want to show it in percentages or do you want to show it in parts? Because sometimes I've had clients who say to me, well, I've worked it out in parts. I haven't worked it out in percentages, which is advanced for a client, because usually clients just think about percentages. But so we'll have that option built to be available. So here is the distribution. Remember, we divided it a third to Alex, and then a third divided between Luke, and Mitchell was getting a percentage, an amount, and then in the last one, it was split 50-50 between Jay and Lily. We're working on this graphic summary as well to indicate when there's sub portions, what percentage that's going to be, because right now it doesn't do that, but we're going to have that as well. We have them on our list. You know, you hear that from me all the time. So we appreciate your patience with us on this, because there's lots to do. So those, that's sort of what I wanted to show you about your options in residue gifts. Anybody have any questions about that?
Jordan, it's Nancy.
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi, Nancy.
I'm just a tad confused. So if Alex dies, what happens to his portion? Does it drop through to the final residual?
Yeah, so let me show you based on the drafting. So yes, you're quite correct. That's what happens because we're using floating shares. So it says, if at least one beneficiary referred to below, because we had a gift over to his issue, right? So we said if at least one beneficiary referred to below is alive, then deal with 33.3 parts. If nobody was alive, these 33.3 parts would never get created, right? Because it just says divide into as many parts as is necessary. Well, those wouldn't be necessary. So now we have 33 if that were the case, if this didn't exist at all,
okay, there
wouldn't be any parts here. So now we say, okay, now how many parts do we need? Well, we need 33.3 parts here because Mitchell's alive. And we need 33.3 parts if Jay or Lily are alive. So now we know that there's we need 66.6 parts or parts. And in essence, what's happening is 50% is going to Mitchell and 50% is being split between Jay and Lily automatically. That's how floating shares work. If they're not needed, they don't get created, and everybody moves up pro rata.
So rather than taking that amount and giving it one third, and one third to drop through, we then split it so that it's now 50-50.
It automatically does that. That's correct. Okay. Yeah. And that's really how most wills are drafted.
Okay.
Once you've gone through, like you can build as many as many options here. You could say, okay, and if he leaves no issue, you know, I want it to go to this person. And if they don't have, you know, or you can, but if there's nobody who's going to get that portion, what we don't want to do is create that portion and have it lapse, because that's what would happen. So that's why, that's how floating shares work. We don't know how many shares we're going to need until we evaluate the, you know, the terms.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Only I'm used to seeing language that would say as many portions as there are people alive kind of thing, rather than
Right,
the distinct 33.3%,
right.
33.3.
Yeah, if you were dividing it equally, that's exactly what it would say. So I think, I don't know if I had one where it was, but if you said, you know, divided among my children equally, well, then it would say, you know, divided into as many shares as are necessary, pay one share to each child who's alive, pay each child who's not alive and has children, that kind of thing. So,
All right.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Hi, Jordan. Sarah.
Hi.
I've talked to Michaela a few times about this because I was always finding it really complicated to know when I had to divide one segment into multiple parts or do multiple segments. So this is helpful. And Michaela's been very helpful with it, trying to keep me straight on this.
Now, there's nothing wrong, just so you know, you can do it a different way. It will still work, and it'll still draft properly and all of that. It's just, you know, I think it's kind of, rather than taking 100% and then dividing it, you know, into different percentages, I personally like to do segments, but it still will work. If you wanted to just always start with 100% segment and then, you know, then divide it, it'll draft it properly. So, because we have to, the thing is, you know, it's a balance, right? The software has to be flexible enough to pretty much do anything that you've ever come across with clients who say, oh yeah, take 25% and then split that into 4 different, so we have to be able to do that. Plus we've got to be able to do sort of the simpler ones. And so that's why this checklist might be, we'll post this. And I think that's a pretty good solution to when to use one or the other.
Jordy, how can you show us how you would change the name of segment 1 to Alex's portion in the portal? How do you do that?
Okay, so I go edit. So here's what I would do. I go back to the segments. So we want to change this name, segment 1. So we go edit and we say Alex's share. Okay.
Thank you.
And now, just to show you, it'll come up Alex's share.
Great, pretty easy. Thank you.
I usually just use segment 1, segment 2, segment 3. But
Okay.
Other questions on residue that people have had? Try to find that one where we have, oops, I think it was here. Alex's share. So it'll throughout say Alex's share, right?
Hey, Jordy, I have a question on Antilabs provisions that you kind of touched on earlier.
Sure.
Not necessarily in the for a residue, but for a gift of real estate. I know that if the testator is giving a class gift, that you can that the Antilabs provisions would apply. But
well, okay, so let's just go to the Antilabs provision. So we're talking about the Succession Law Reform Act, and specifically we're talking about substitutional gifts. So I'll just go to that for a second and just say it's section 31. There it is. So where a devise or bequest is made to a child, grandchild, brother, or sister, okay? So this is actually something we should probably put a warning in for, and we will. Michaela or Thomas, make a note to do this. But If you made a gift, let's say $100,000, I say a gift, $100,000 to my son, period. I don't say if he is alive at the survival date. I don't do any of that. Oh, that's why we don't have a warning, because it never does that. Okay, so if you're drafting this on your own, you make that mistake, or you don't put, you just say a gift to a child or a grandchild or a brother or sister, and you don't say if he or she is alive at the survival date, and they die, they predecease you, it's going to go to their spouse or their issue. Okay, estate doesn't cause that problem. We never rely on substitutional gifts, because it always puts in that they have to be alive at a certain date. Okay, so you should, just as a matter of education, you should just be aware that if you ever do this manually outside of estate and you're making a gift to somebody, like a child, grandchild, brother, or sister, make sure you put in a contrary intention. If that is a contrary intention being if he or she is alive at the survival date. Sorry, now go ahead. I interrupted.
No worries. So in that case, dad and mom have two real estate properties. One of them is home and the other one is rental. And they kind of want, like after both of them die, they want to transfer title to all 4 children.
Yes.
Who are also the residuary beneficiaries.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of wanted to make sure that if we're putting so transfer title to this property to my children, would that make them so the instructions were, if one of them dies without any children, their share should go to the other siblings. But if they have children, then their share goes to their children.
Right.
Would that make them tenants in common or joint tenants?
You'd want to draft that properly. So you'd want to say, you'd basically want to give the gift of whatever it is. Let's just take an example here of a, doesn't matter, family cottage, okay? So you'd say, okay, I want it to go to my children. Now, estate's going to avoid the anti-lapse problem automatically. So here's what's going to happen. Let me just generate that. So I just did a simple gift to the children with a gift over to their issue, okay? Mm-hmm. Assuming you didn't consider all the other issues about, but in this case, it shouldn't be a big deal because they're residue beneficiaries. I'm not sure why you do a specific gift of those assets. Why wouldn't you just have it fall into the residue?
I guess the client wants to give them the option to continue renting the property without having to.
Well, they could.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I would personally, I would have that just fall into the residue of the estate.
Okay.
Yeah. So this says, okay, if any or all of my children are alive at the survival date, so it avoids this gift over this lapse problem, then transfer them to those who are alive. And if any of my beneficiaries are not alive, the family cottage, so you would have to redraft this, but the portion of the family cottage to which the predeceased beneficiary would have been entitled shall be divided among the issue of the predeceased beneficiary. So it sort of gives you, that's how you would sort of do that.
Okay. And are they technically joint tenants or tenants in common?
Tenants in common.
Tenants in common, right? Okay.
Yeah. And again, that's something we should work on as far as the drafting. Sure. Sorry, go ahead.
Would you include tenants in common as a special provision, or I think it's always better to clarify that.
Yeah, I would. I think it actually does say as tenants in common.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, it does. One thing that we're working on is is specific gifts of assets, making it more powerful. So what we're going to build in is the option for you to direct. Does the client want it sold and the proceeds divided? Do you want it? What happens if one of the beneficiaries is not alive? And so you're gonna be able to do it in a more complicated and fulsome manner. We're building that out because we see that as sort of a more niche thing that needs to be done. There's a couple of other chat things here. Stupid question. What happens to the remaining? There is no third, right? Good question. It's not a stupid question. So that 33.3%, right? We don't use percentages. We're using parts. If you use percentages, it'd be a problem, but we're using parts. So that's why we're saying 33.3 parts and 33.3. So technically there's not 100 parts that are created. There are 99.9 parts created, and that's fine. you can have as many parts. You could have 1 part, 3 parts, 14.68 parts. It doesn't have to add up to 100. The only time it has to add up to 100 is if you're using percentages, and you should never use percentages in a will for giving away specific amounts, right? That's an issue. How do I generate this marriage agreement clause? So, and I know that this is in the works for other agreements like shareholder agreements and other agreements, but I'll show you how you create that. If you indicated that your, I think it was Claire. So if I went to Claire, we're talking about her marriage contract. So if we went to direct relationships and when we set this up, we probably indicated that there was an agreement. So, but if you said, you'd go to the person they're married and you can click on marriage agreement in place. And if you click on that, it will produce that clause. And that's actually asked when you first generate the people, whether if they're married, it'll ask you that. But if you didn't and you needed to change it, you can go back in direct relationships and then add that information. And I don't know but we're building in why it hasn't happened yet, but we're building in the ability for separation agreements and shareholder agreements and things like that to populate as well. And it has to do with the relationships, and it's more complicated than I had anticipated. So.
Interesting.
Other questions? And don't forget, there's this little, at the top here, beside your initials, there's a question mark. And if you go there, it'll take you to our support tab and our help desk, and really has questions about, residues and segments. So if you had a question about segments, you don't leave the app. You're basically still in the app, and you can have both running at the same time. So here I've got this running and I'm searching as well. And it explains to you about multiple segments and how to do that and those kinds of things. So you can search within the app. So, well, thanks. It's just past 1 and I didn't want to keep anybody any longer, but I'm happy to stay if anybody has any questions about anything. And yeah. Good. Well, thanks everybody.
There's a question in the chat, Jordy.
Oh, in the chat? Okay, sure. Thank you. In the will pair, if the person is alive and not the other, right? So that's an excellent question. So if, and we were building actually an advisor alert for that. So it's going to say, okay, you've got to add, you don't have to, but you should add a further gift over. So let me just find that. I think that was in segment 2. Yeah. So here for Mitchell for 100%. Now we didn't add any gift over. So that's a problem. So probably what I'd want to say is, okay, if they're not alive, then it goes to the other segments. Now it would be proper. So we should build in, and I'm going to do that right now, that there should be an advisor alert in this situation where you've given a cash gift and there's no gift over here. So if you do it properly, you shouldn't have a problem, but I'm going to actually probably build in that warning. And it's really only crucial where there's that $10,000 legacy. So we'll do that. That's an excellent point. But that's basically what you should be doing. Should be doing the gift over here to the other segments if they're not alive. Did that answer the question? I hope. So you still have to, there is still, we're trying to avoid having to think too much, but I've got to build that in because right now you do have to think of that and we don't want you to have to. So. All right. Anything else? Well, thanks everybody. And, can you now see what the will looks like? So I'll generate the will and show you what it now looks like. So if Mitchell's not alive, the gift shall be divided among the other segments pro rata. So that's what we've got there. Okay. Now, this is a case where it's the survival date. So you won't need this reference because this is more if there was a trust for Mitchell that we'd have to worry about it. So you don't have to include that because this survival date is applicable to all the other segments. But you can imagine if this was a trust for Mitchell and then died, and he died some date later, well, we would want you to apportion among the segments and determine the people as of his death rather than the survival date. So that's why it's got this extra blank in there, which would be filled in if you needed it. Okay. And there's a footnote there to just remind you, have a careful look at that, right? Just make sure it works because there are so many different things that could happen. You just want to make sure, we try to remind you when it's really something unusual that you want you to look at. Okay. Any other questions? Great. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon and feel free to email us with any questions and we'll talk to you again. Thanks.